Yes, but overwhelmingly, Aisha, it's not possible to just say, oh, leave the prisons full. They're going to be completely full within the month, is my understanding. And then, whoever does the most horrendous, homicide, rape, robbery, whatever it is, can't be dealt with because there's no place to put him. Obviously, you've got to do something that's much better than that. And this is pretty well graded, I think, given the situation that we are in. And hopefully, will have a minimum impact on victims. A lot of kinds of offender are going to be ruled out, as my understanding is. All sex offenders, all rape offenders, stalkers, all people who are recognizable as domestic abuse, non-fatal strangulation, coercive control, breaches of domestic abuse orders. The worst people in the category that is going
Sure.
to be
I
cut
suppose,
back is not going to be freed in this way. And so, in a way, it is simply the minimum
yeah.
that can achieve something quick to make sure that there is a place for me if I do something absolutely terrible, because
But
otherwise law and order just comes to a complete.
and another listener has just asked Martin about if people are released early, will there be things like electronic tagging to sort of reassure the public? When people are released early, are they just released into the wild? How does all of that work in terms of monitoring people?
So it's really important actually to understand how the work of probation works on the front line. There are a range of measures that are put in place when somebody is released from custody. They can be put on an electronic tag. We've now got sobriety tags to check, for example, their drinking, which may be useful for somebody that perhaps is in prison for alcohol-related offending. So there's strong license conditions, but it's how is that monitored? How is the risk assessment done to understand whether that person may be high, medium, or low risk? Getting that information is absolutely crucial for the system to operate effectively. If you look at the front line, the reality is there are around about 50,000 people released from prison each year. The probation service already manages a really difficult and complex caseload, and good probation practice does ensure that people are kept safe, but it's ensuring they have the information they need, the risk assessment tools, and the capacity to deal with that. That's absolutely crucial. And housing, I can't overemphasize
Yeah.
how important that is. If you're releasing somebody from prison, they don't have a home to go to, there's a really high chance they're going to reoffend and be back into custody or committing further offences quite quickly thereafter.
Yeah, and the housing piece of the puzzle is so important because if people don't have sort of safe, secure housing, and for example they're sleeping rough, then there's, as you say, there's such a high likelihood that they'll end up back, whether it's kind of drugs, substance abuse, and then crime again. A couple of our listeners, Martin, have just messaged in saying, "What about using suspended sentences or deferred sentences? Would that help?"
So suspended sentences are certainly something that the courts are able to use and ensure that person is back in the community being supervised by the probation service with the threat of prison hanging over them if they do not behave. It's certainly a tool that they have. My concern, I have to say, given my understanding of the numbers, is would that be enough in the short term? I fear that the option the government is looking at is perhaps the least worst of the options that are available. But it's really important to look at the long term, actually. You're taking an emergency measure here to relieve some of that pressure. But I think there's a really need to focus on the medium term. How do we ensure we have sufficient prison capacity and probation capacity to deal with the issues that are facing us? And it takes a long time to build a prison. You can't, it's not months, it's years in the planning to ensure that you bring that capacity on board. So how do you cope with that over 5 or 10 years rather than perhaps the next year? It's really important that you get that right. But unfortunately, I fear that the early release, obviously we don't have the detail yet from the Lord Chancellor in relation to exactly what is planned, but getting that right, I think, is absolutely crucial to ensure that people are able to properly manage those cases.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think you make a really important point about a sort of a long-term strategy, which is to say looking at prison and very much probation. Really important to not forget about probation. And Martin, thank you very much for your time. That's Martin, who's the Martin Jones, Chief Inspector of Probation. Well, let's now bring in Dame Vera Baird, former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, and Vera also served under the last Labour government. Dame Vera, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
What's your feeling about this announcement, particularly with your hat on as a former Victims Commissioner?
I think that the idea of early release is going to worry people who've been victims. They know that a judge, very well schooled, studied, looked at the facts, balanced culpability and harm, and came to a calculation about what should be served, what was appropriate. And they know, of course, that it's not their interests that are being considered when that changes. It is the pressure on the prison service. So I feel that there will be concern. What I would say is that many people will have a victim liaison officer with the probation service. So there are specific probation people who look after victims of people who get longer than a specific length of sentence. So some of the people whose offenders are being released will be able to ask about all the detail that follows from their victim liaison officer. And I mean, the alternative, if you're not in that category, would be to approach victim support or whoever had supported you in the first place to find out more detail. I mean, I heard what Martin Jones just said, and I agree with him that this is the least worst thing. It seems to me the alternative to not cutting people out of prison is that there is no room for whoever, and doing it in a systematic way. The alternative is that there's no room in prison for whoever commits whatever crime they choose to commit, and then we're in a very random and
Well,
wild
it's two very bad choices, isn't it? It's kind of two bad scenarios. Anne has messaged in saying, one of our listeners, Vera, saying, Aisha, I'm getting heartily sick about hearing about support for prisoners, aftercare for prisoners, housing opportunity for prisoners being released early. Since when were these people reclassified as victims of their own crime? I fear for the actual victims who will find that their offender is coming to a street near them. And look, Vera, I mean, what Anne has articulated there is something that a lot of people will just feel on a kind of human level. We know that crime is going up. We know that antisocial behaviour is going up. And a lot of crime, which is not classified as very serious crime, still has a profound psychological effect on you as an individual. If you have been the victim of crime, if you have been mugged, or if you have been if your house has been broken into when you and your children are sleeping there. I mean, is there a feeling that many victims are just going to think, well, hang on a minute, I understand this is a crisis point because of bad planning, but what about us, the victim?
Yes, of course, and they're absolutely right to do so. I mean, victims are given too little regard in the criminal justice system generally. As we've just been saying, two bad choices, yes, but overwhelmingly, Aisha, it's not possible to just say, oh, leave the prisons full. They're going to be completely full within the month, is my understanding. And then, whoever does the most horrendous, homicide, rape, robbery, whatever it is, can't be dealt with because there's no place to put him. Obviously, you've got to do something that's much better than that. And this is pretty well graded, I think, given the situation that we are in. And hopefully will have a minimum impact on victims. A lot of kinds of offender are going to be ruled out, as my understanding is. All sex offenders, all rape offenders, stalkers, all people who are recognizable as domestic abuse, non-fatal strangulation, coercive control, breaches of domestic abuse orders. The worst people in the category that is going
Sure.
to be
I
cut
suppose,
back is not going to be freed in this way. And so, in a way, it is simply the minimum
yeah.
that can achieve something quick to make sure that there is a place for me if I do something absolutely terrible, because
But
otherwise, law and order just comes to a complete stop. Police are deterred as they
yeah.
were under Tories from arresting.
But
Courts can't deal with people, so
I
that's
s-
how it is.
I suppose, I mean, they have obviously said that very, very serious offenders, particularly the ones that you have said. But I suppose going back to a point I raised earlier, Labour, along with the Conservatives, made a lot about antisocial behaviour in the run up to the election, particularly crimes like shoplifting, which are not the most serious crime at the end of the day. But if that's your business repeatedly being shoplifted, that's, it's not a victimless crime. Is this going to send a signal to some criminals, which is well, a, the prisons are overcrowded. We know the criminal justice system is in a bad space, but knowing that actually you won't have to serve, you know, a lengthy prison sentence, is that going to kind of, you know, affect the sort of deterrence level at that level of crime?
You know, I'm absolutely sympathetic with folk whose shops are getting robbed. I witnessed one myself, only up the road here in quite posh North London very recently, and it is going to drive people out of business if it's not stopped. Of course, the answer is that is happening now, and there is no capacity to imprison these people. There is not, if there are no places, any capacity to arrest them, actually. And so on. And how can the Lord Chancellor free up the logjam in the courts where victims of crime are waiting year after year after year, particularly sexual abuse, particularly rape, particularly stalking, and particularly domestic abuse, to get into court? How can she free it up if nobody can be sentenced if they're convicted?